The rain had been falling all evening, a steady rhythm against the windows, as I finished washing the dishes. The house was quiet, too quiet. Ever since my brother Daniel had gone missing, silence had become a painful reminder of his absence. 2 years. That's how long it had been. 2 long years since we last saw him, since he vanished without a trace while deployed overseas. The military said they had no answers, just that his unit had been ambushed, and his body was never recovered. Presumed dead, that's what they told us. But my mother never accepted it. She refused to hold a funeral, refused to move on. She always said, a mother knows when her child is gone, and I know, he's not. I never had the heart to argue with her. Then, at exactly 8:42 p.m., there was a knock at the door, a slow, deliberate knock. I froze. No one ever came unannounced, not this late. Mom and Dad were in the living room, but neither of them reacted. Maybe they hadn't heard it over the sound of the TV. Another knock. My chest tightened as I wiped my hands on a towel and walked toward the door. A strange feeling crept over me, something between fear and hope. When I reached the door, I hesitated before unlocking it, and then I pulled it open. My breath caught in my throat. There, standing in the dim porch light, soaked from the rain, was my brother. Daniel. He was alive. But something was wrong. His eyes, hollow, distant, filled with a weight I didn't recognize. He looked thinner, older, like he had been carrying a burden too heavy for one man to bear. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Then in a low, almost broken voice, he said the words that would change everything. I need you to listen carefully. I can't stay long, and you can't tell anyone I was here. I stood frozen in the doorway, rain dripping from my brother's clothes onto the wooden porch. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. What do you mean? I whispered, barely able to form the words. Daniel glanced past me into the house, his jaw tight. Is Mom here? Dad? They're in the living room. My voice shook. Daniel, everyone thinks you're dead. He flinched, as if the words physically hurt him. Then, before I could say anything else, he stepped forward, pushing past me into the house. His movements were quick, nervous. He closed the door behind him and turned the lock. Lock the back door too, he said. I hesitated. Daniel, what's going on? I can't explain everything right now. He ran a hand through his soaked hair. But I need you to trust me. His voice was urgent, but there was something else. Something fragile, like he was barely holding himself together. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. This was my brother, my Daniel. The same person who used to steal my fries when Mom wasn't looking. The same one who promised to always protect me. And yet, there was a darkness in his eyes now. Before I could move, there was the sound of footsteps. My mother's voice echoed from the hallway. Who's at the door, sweetie? I turned just as she stepped into view. Her gaze landed on Daniel, and the world seemed to stop. Her hands trembled as they covered her mouth. A soft, broken sound escaped her lips, something between a sob and a gasp. Daniel? Tears streamed down her face as she reached for him, but instead of moving toward her, Daniel took a step back. Mom, please, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You can't tell anyone I'm here. My mother's face twisted in confusion. What? But, Daniel, you. I need you to listen to me, he interrupted, his voice suddenly firm. He looked at both of us. I shouldn't be alive, and if the wrong people find out that I am, we're all in danger. The room fell into a stunned silence. Only the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of rain tapping against the windows filled the space. I could see the questions swirling in my mother's teary eyes, but Daniel's words had paralyzed her. She just stood there, her hands trembling at her sides. Daniel, I whispered, stepping closer. What do you mean? Who's looking for you? His eyes darted to the windows, as if he expected someone to be watching. Then, in a voice so low it barely carried over the silence, he said, I can't tell you everything. The less you know, the safer you'll be. I shook my head, frustration and fear gnawing inside me. That's not good enough. You were missing for 2 years. They told us you were dead, and now you show up out of nowhere, telling us to keep quiet? Do you know what we've been through? Daniel's face tightened with guilt, but he didn't look away. I know, he said, and I'm sorry, but if I had come back sooner they would have found me, and if they find me they'll come for you too. Pooh. My mother finally spoke, her voice shaking. Who's after you, Daniel? He hesitated. Then, after a long breath, he whispered, People who don't want the truth to come out. A chill ran down my spine. Something happened, he continued. The ambush, it wasn't random. We weren't supposed to survive, but I did. His eyes darkened. And I know things that could ruin some very powerful people. My mother covered her mouth, shaking her head. Oh my God, I felt like the walls were closing in around me. Daniel, you need help. We should go to the authorities. No. His voice was sharp, almost desperate. You don't understand. I can't trust anyone, not the military, not the government, no one. He took a shaky breath. I need to disappear again. But first, I need to know you'll be safe. I reached for his hand. He was freezing. Daniel, please, don't leave us again. For a moment something broke in his expression. I saw the little boy I used to chase through the backyard, the brother who always looked out for me. Then, headlights flashed outside. Daniel's entire body went rigid. He grabbed my wrist. Turn off the lights. Now. Panic gripped my chest as I rushed to switch off the living room lights. The house plunged into darkness, and the only illumination came from the headlights outside, cutting through the rain like sharp blades. Daniel moved quickly, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside. His breath was shallow, controlled, but I could feel the tension radiating from him. Who is it? I whispered, barely able to get the words out. He didn't answer right away. My mother stood frozen behind us, one hand pressed against her heart, her breaths quick and uneven. The car outside idled for a few seconds, its headlights sweeping across our driveway. My pulse pounded in my ears. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the car reversed and slowly drove away. Daniel exhaled, his shoulders lowering just slightly, but he didn't relax, not fully. They're watching, he muttered. I swallowed hard. Who? He turned to me, his face pale. People who don't want me talking to anyone. If they knew I was here, you wouldn't have even heard the knock at the door before they got to me. His words sent a fresh wave of terror through me. Daniel, my mother choked out, stepping forward, her hands trembling. Please, you have to tell us what's happening. Let us help you. Daniel hesitated, his jaw clenching. I don't want to put you in danger. That's why I have to leave again. No. My mother shook her head fiercely. I already lost you once. I won't lose you again. My throat tightened. We can figure this out together. You don't have to run. His gaze softened, and for a second I thought he might stay. But then, just as quickly, his expression hardened again. I came back for one reason, he said, his voice firm. There's something I need you to keep safe. Reaching into his jacket, he pulled out a small, worn-out envelope. He pressed it into my hands. Do not open this, he warned. Not unless something happens to me. A lump formed in my throat. Daniel? The sound of another car approaching made him tense up again. He turned toward the back door. I have to go, he whispered. No matter what happens, do not tell anyone you saw me. Tears burned my eyes. Daniel, please don't. But before I could stop him, he slipped out the back door and disappeared into the night. And I was left standing there, gripping the envelope, my heart pounding with fear. The back door clicked shut, and Daniel was gone. I stood there, gripping the small, weathered envelope he had pressed into my hands. My fingers trembled as I stared at it, my mind spinning. My mother was crying softly, covering her mouth to stifle the sobs. This isn't real, she whispered. This can't be real. I wanted to comfort her, but I couldn't even comfort myself. My brother, whom we had mourned for 2 years, had just reappeared, and now he was gone again, vanishing into the night like a ghost. I looked down at the envelope. It was old, the edges frayed, as if it had been carried around for a long time. No name on the front, no markings, just a sealed flap that seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. Daniel had told me not to open it. But how could I not? My hands shook as I turned it over, running my thumb over the seam. My mother's breath hitched. Don't, she whispered. He said not to. I hesitated. Every instinct in me screamed to rip it open, to finally get some answers. But my mother was right. Daniel had risked everything just to bring this to us. There had to be a reason. I swallowed hard and tucked the envelope into my sweater pocket. Just then, another pair of headlights flashed through the window. I froze. Not the same car as before. This one was darker, bigger. It slowed as it reached our house, rolling to a stop right outside. My mother grabbed my arm. Is it him? She whispered. I peered out through the curtain, my breath catching. No, it wasn't Daniel. Two men stepped out of the vehicle, dressed in dark clothing. They weren't carrying umbrellas, even though the rain still fell in steady sheets. They walked with purpose, their heads turning toward our house. Something about them made my stomach churn. A sharp knock rattled the front door. My mother tensed beside me, my pulse pounded. Then a deep, firm voice called out, "Mrs. Hayes, this is Special Agent Collins. We need to ask you some questions about your son." I sucked in a sharp breath. My mother went rigid. They knew. Somehow, they knew. And suddenly, Daniel's warning echoed in my mind. "No matter what happens, do not tell anyone you saw me." My mother and I exchanged a terrified glance. The knocking came again, harder this time. "Mrs. Hayes?" The man's voice was sharp, impatient. My mind raced. If these men were really federal agents, why did they come in the middle of the night? Why did their presence feel more like a threat than a request? I pressed my hand against my sweater pocket, feeling the outline of the envelope. Daniel had trusted me with this. He had begged us to stay quiet. I had to protect him. My mother's lips trembled. She looked ready to collapse. I grabbed her hand and squeezed it, silently telling her to follow my lead. Taking a steadying breath, I walked to the door, leaving the chain lock in place as I cracked it open just an inch. Cold air and the scent of rain swept in. Two men stood on the porch, their dark suits damp from the weather. The taller one, presumably Agent Collins, had sharp features and piercing eyes that studied me with unsettling intensity. The other man, stockier with graying hair, stood slightly behind him, his gaze scanning the house. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. Agent Collins pulled out a badge, but he barely gave me time to inspect it before slipping it back into his coat. "We're looking for Daniel Hayes," he said. "We have reason to believe he may have contacted you." My heart nearly stopped. I forced a frown. "Daniel?" I repeated, feigning confusion. "That's not possible." The agent tilted his head slightly. "And why is that?" I swallowed, gripping the edge of the door tighter. "Because he's dead," I said, my voice cracking just enough to sound convincing. "The military told us 2 years ago. We had to accept it." I blinked quickly, as if holding back tears. "Why would you even ask something like that?" Agent Collins studied me carefully, his eyes searching for cracks in my story. "Because there are reports suggesting he may still be alive," he said. "And if he is, we need to find him immediately." I forced a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "Well, if my brother is alive, I'd love to know where he is." I let my voice rise slightly, throwing in a touch of anger. "Because we buried nothing but grief in this house." The agent's jaw twitched, but he didn't react otherwise. He glanced past me into the dimly lit house, then turned to my mother, who stood pale and silent a few steps behind me. "Mrs. Hayes, have you noticed anything unusual tonight? Anything at all?" I could feel my mother's hands shaking at her sides. For a horrible moment I thought she might break, but then she lifted her chin, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," she said, "nothing at all." A long silence stretched between us. Finally, Agent Collins exhaled through his nose and nodded. "If anything comes to mind, you'll call us." It wasn't a request. He reached into his coat, pulled out a card, and slid it onto the small table beside the door. Then, without another word, he and his partner turned and walked back toward their car. I barely breathed as I watched them get in and drive away, their taillights vanishing into the darkness. Only when the silence returned did I close the door, my knees nearly giving out beneath me. My mother pressed a shaking hand to her chest. "What have we just done?" I reached into my pocket, pulling out the envelope. "I don't know," I whispered. "But whatever's in here, it's the reason Daniel's still running." The moment the agents were gone, the air in the house felt heavier. My mother sank onto the couch, her hands still trembling. I stood there, gripping the envelope so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My mind screamed at me to open it. Daniel had told me not to. But how could I protect something I didn't understand? I hesitated for only a second before I carefully peeled the flap open. Inside was a single folded paper and a small flash drive. I pulled out the paper first, unfolding it with shaky hands. The writing was small, rushed, like it had been written under extreme pressure. My heart pounded as I read the first few lines. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it back. You need to listen carefully." I sucked in a breath and continued reading. "The ambush wasn't an accident. We were set up. Someone high up in command wanted us dead. I was the only one who survived, but they didn't report that. They covered it up and declared me KIA. I've spent the last 2 years running, trying to gather proof. The drive contains classified files, evidence of the betrayal. It names the people responsible. If it falls into the wrong hands, I won't be the only one they'll come after. I wanted to keep you out of this, but I had no choice. If something happens to me, you need to get this to someone you trust, someone outside the system. Do not trust the government, do not trust the military, and whatever you do, don't let them find you with this. My breath came in short gasps. The words blurred as my mind raced to process what I had just read. This was bigger than I had imagined. Daniel wasn't just running, he was being hunted. I looked at the flash drive in my palm. This tiny piece of metal held the truth, and now it was in my hands. A sudden chill ran through me as a terrifying realization sank in. If those agents had even the slightest suspicion that Daniel had come here, they would be back. And this time, they wouldn't just be asking questions. I stood there in the dim living room, holding the flash drive like it could burn me at any moment. My hands were trembling so much that I could barely keep a grip on it. My mind was spinning. Everything was happening so fast, and yet it all felt like it was spiraling out of control. I turned to look at my mother. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. The weight of the situation was clearly sinking in for her too. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, unable to answer. The truth was, I didn't know what to do. I had never been in a situation like this. Daniel had trusted me with this. He had asked me to protect the evidence. But at what cost? If I kept it, we were all in danger. If I destroyed it, we might never know what really happened. I glanced at the window, half expecting to see headlights shining through the rain again. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound outside made me jump. The quiet was deafening. I couldn't stay here. Not like this. "Mom, we can't stay here," I said, my voice firm, though my stomach was in knots. "We need to move. At least for tonight. We'll figure out what to do with this in the morning." My mother looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and trust. "But where will we go?" "I don't know yet," I replied. "But we can't wait around for those agents to come back. We can't risk it." She nodded slowly, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "You're right, but what about Daniel?" "He's out there," I said, my voice tight. "We don't know where he is, but we can't get him involved anymore. We need to protect ourselves." I moved quickly, gathering a few things, clothes, my purse, and the flash drive, shoving everything into a bag. My mind was on overdrive, but the panic that had been rising in my chest seemed to push me into action. My mother was already getting her things together, though she seemed lost in thought, unsure of what we were doing or where we were going. She was trusting me, and that felt like both a heavy responsibility and a deep comfort. We slipped out the back door quietly, making sure not to leave any trace of our departure. The rain had slowed down, but the night still felt thick with tension. Every step I took made the weight of the flash drive in my pocket feel heavier. But no matter how heavy it felt, there was no turning back now. I didn't know where we were going yet, but I did know one thing. Daniel's warning was only the beginning, and now it was our turn to decide how far we were willing to go to protect the truth. We drove in silence for hours, the dark roads ahead swallowed by the thick rain. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my fingers ached, but I couldn't let go. Not now. Every sound, every shadow on the road felt like a warning. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the headlights of a car trailing behind us. But the streets were empty, and the rain kept falling, steady and unrelenting. My mother sat quietly beside me, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She didn't ask any more questions. She didn't have to. The look in her eyes was enough. She was scared, just like me, but she was trusting me to get us through this. We didn't talk about where we were headed. I didn't know where to go. But I knew one thing for sure, there was no way we could go back home. The agents would be watching. They were already suspicious, and if they found us now, everything would fall apart. The further we drove, the more my mind raced. What was on that flash drive? What did Daniel know that could bring down these people? These forces that had so much power. I kept thinking about his words. Do not trust the government. Do not trust the military. The people he was talking about were ruthless, and they would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. The rain began to let up, and the headlights from the car revealed an old motel up ahead. It looked run down, but at least it was a place to stop. I turned into the parking lot, my tires squealing slightly as they hit the wet surface. I pulled into a spot and turned off the engine, feeling the weight of the silence settle around us. "We need to stay here for the night," I said, though I could feel the unease in my voice. "It's not safe to keep driving. We'll figure out what to do in the morning." My mother nodded, her face drawn with exhaustion. She didn't argue, just slowly opened the door and stepped out into the misty air. I followed her, locking the car as we made our way into the motel's small office. The bell above the door chimed as we entered. The man behind the counter looked up from his book, glancing at us for a moment before he gave us a lazy smile. "A room for the night?" he asked, his voice thick with indifference. I nodded, sliding some cash across the counter. "Just for one night." He handed me the key with a slight nod and pointed toward the end of the hallway. We didn't say much as we made our way to the room. The door creaked as I opened it and we stepped inside. The room was small, sparsely furnished, but it would do for now. I locked the door behind us, then dropped the bag on the bed. "Mom, we have to stay calm," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We're safe for now, but we need to make a plan. Tomorrow we'll figure out what to do with the flash drive. But for tonight we have to lay low." She nodded slowly, but didn't say anything. She sank into the chair by the window, staring out at the rain-soaked parking lot. I sat down on the bed, the weight of everything settling in my chest. We were so close to the truth, but at the same time, we were so far from it. And somewhere out there, Daniel was still running. I couldn't sleep. The bed felt too small, the room too quiet, and every creak of the motel building seemed to echo in my mind. My body was exhausted, but my mind raced. The flash drive was still in my pocket, pressing against me like a secret I wasn't sure I was ready to face. My mother had fallen asleep in the chair by the window, her head tilted against the cool glass, her body curled into itself. I couldn't bring myself to join her. I was too afraid. At some point in the night, I must have dozed off. When I woke up, the room was still dark, save for the faint glow of the neon sign outside casting a pinkish hue across the walls. My pulse quickened. Something had changed. I moved quietly, careful not to wake my mother. The flash drive was still in my pocket, but now it felt heavier. It wasn't just a file anymore, it was a life or death decision. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. My breath hitched in my throat. I froze, staring at the door as if I could somehow will the knock to stop. Again. Knock, knock, knock. My heart hammered against my ribs. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice shaky, betraying my fear. There was no answer, just the soft shuffle of footsteps outside the door. I glanced at my mother, still asleep, unaware of the danger that was inching closer to us. Another knock, louder this time. I couldn't take the chance of them waking her up. I slowly approached the door, heart in my throat. I didn't know if it was the agents again or someone else entirely, but whoever it was, they were not here to play nice. I hesitated, my hand on the door handle. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips, and then the door handle rattled. A voice, low and urgent, came through the crack. "We know you're in there. We need to talk. Open the door." My blood ran cold. This wasn't a polite request. These people were not here to ask questions. I stumbled back, instinctively grabbing the flash drive and shoving it deep into my pocket. I had to protect it. I had to protect us. "We're just passing through," I called out, trying to sound calm. "We'll be gone in the morning. Please, just leave us alone." The voice outside was cold, uncompromising. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." The door handle rattled again, and I knew then that they weren't going to leave until they got what they wanted. I had no choice. I motioned to my mother to stay quiet, my eyes wide with panic. She was still groggy, half-conscious from the sleep, but when she saw the fear in my face, she instantly understood. We had to get out. I didn't think, I just acted. I grabbed the bag and pulled her towards the back window. The rain was still falling, but we couldn't afford to wait any longer. I pushed the window open, letting the cool air flood in, and then I helped my mother climb out, my heart pounding. The alley behind the motel was dark, shadowed by the tall buildings that loomed on either side. We crouched low, trying to stay hidden. I could hear the sound of footsteps coming from the hallway, growing louder. My mind screamed at me to run, but I couldn't abandon the flash drive. It felt like the only thing that could protect us now. I turned and pulled my mother with me, racing into the darkness, leaving the safety of the motel behind. We had to disappear. We had to disappear now. We ran through the alley, my breath coming in quick, panicked bursts. The rain made everything slippery, and I nearly lost my footing a few times. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't slow down. I glanced back, half expecting to see flashlights or hear voices coming from the motel. But the alley was quiet, the only sound our hurried footsteps echoing off the walls. I gripped my mother's hand tightly, trying to keep her close. We couldn't risk going back to the car. The agents would be looking for us, watching every possible route. The motel was already compromised. The flash drive had to stay with us, no matter what. I spotted a streetlight ahead, dim but enough to get a glimpse of the street. We couldn't stay hidden forever, but I knew we had to find somewhere to lay low. When we reached the street, I paused. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to think. "Mom," I whispered, "we need to keep moving. We can't stop now." She nodded, her face pale and exhausted, but there was a fire in her eyes now, a spark of resolve that I hadn't seen before. We walked quickly, ducking into side streets and staying away from main roads, trying to remain invisible in the shadows. The flash drive burned against my side, reminding me of the danger that was always just a step behind us. I had no plan. I didn't know where to go, but I knew we couldn't stay here. I had to find someone we could trust, someone who could help us figure out what to do with the evidence, someone who could protect us from whatever danger we were running from. But trust had become a luxury I couldn't afford. Daniel's warning echoed in my mind. Do not trust anyone. We passed a small diner that looked like it had seen better days, the neon sign flickering weakly in the rain. I didn't hesitate. It was our only option. Inside, the air was warm, and the smell of coffee lingered in the air. There were a few scattered patrons at the counter, but the place felt quiet, as if the world outside had forgotten it existed. We slid into a booth near the back, trying to keep our heads down. The waitress, a woman in her 50s, gave us a curious glance, but said nothing as she handed us the menu. I could feel my mother's tension beside me. She was scared. I could see it in her eyes. But she said nothing. She trusted me to lead us out of this mess. I turned my attention to the menu, not really seeing the words. I was thinking, planning. We needed to get out of town, but we couldn't do it without a car, and I didn't dare go back to the one we'd left behind at the motel. It was too risky. We needed a new plan, and we needed it fast. The waitress returned to take our order, her eyes lingering on us just a moment too long. Something about the way she looked at us sent a chill down my spine. As she walked away, I leaned in closer to my mother. "We can't stay here long," I whispered. "We have to move again, but I need to think. I need to figure out where we go next." She nodded, her voice barely audible. "We're not safe here, are we?" "No," I replied, my throat tight. "We're not safe anywhere." I stared out the window, watching the rain, my mind turning over the possibilities. The night was far from over, and I knew we had no time to waste. I just hoped that whatever we did next, we weren't walking straight into the lion's den. We stayed in that diner for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only an hour or so. I couldn't stop thinking, my mind racing with all the possible ways things could go wrong. Every moment felt like a countdown. I kept expecting someone to walk in and recognize us, to start asking questions. But nothing happened. The waitress brought us coffee, gave us a half smile, and then disappeared behind the counter. The few other customers seemed to ignore us, absorbed in their own worlds, and I forced myself to relax. I knew we couldn't stay here forever. I couldn't stay hidden behind walls and curtains. I needed answers, and I needed help. I needed to figure out what this was all about before it consumed us completely. But who could we trust? The door to the diner opened, and a man stepped inside, his face covered by the hood of his jacket. He didn't seem to notice us at first, as he made his way to the counter. But something about him caught my attention, something in the way he moved, the way he glanced around the room, cautious but purposeful. I looked away quickly, trying not to make it obvious that I was watching him. but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was different, that there was something about him that stood out. After a moment, he turned, his eyes scanning the diner, and his gaze locked onto mine. For a split second, I froze. He wasn't looking at my mother. He wasn't looking at anyone else in the room. His eyes were fixed on me, steady, as though he knew exactly who I was. I quickly turned my head, pretending I hadn't noticed. My heart started to race again, a familiar knot tightening in my stomach. Had he recognized me? Was this another agent, another person looking for the flash drive? But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him move toward our booth. I tensed up, ready to run, ready to do whatever I could to get out of there. But before I could even make a move, the man spoke, his voice low and calm. "You're not safe here." I blinked, my mind struggling to process his words. "What?" I whispered, unable to make sense of what he was saying. He pulled up a chair without asking and sat down across from us. His eyes never left mine, and for the first time that night, I felt like I was actually being seen. "Listen," he said, glancing at my mother briefly before looking back at me. "I know who you are, and I know what you have." My breath caught in my throat. My first instinct was to get up, to run, but something told me he wasn't here to hurt us. At least, not yet. He continued, his voice even more urgent. "You don't have much time. There are people looking for you. The ones you're running from, they've got eyes everywhere, and they'll stop at nothing to find you. But I can help." I stayed silent, my mind spinning. "How do you know about the flash drive?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "I've been following this for a while now," he said, not bothering to explain further. "And I know exactly what's on it." The weight of his words sank in. He was talking about the evidence, the proof, the truth Daniel had tried to protect. I glanced at my mother, unsure whether to trust this stranger, but her face mirrored my thoughts. She didn't know what to make of this either. "I can get you somewhere safe," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But you have to trust me. There's no time to waste." My mind raced. Should we trust him? Was he one of them, or was he really offering to help us? But then again, who else could we trust? I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest. "What's your plan?" He smiled slightly, as though he had expected that question. "Get the flash drive to the right hands, expose the truth, and make sure you and your mother get out of this alive." I stared at him for a long moment, trying to read his face. There were no guarantees in this world anymore, no promises that could ease the fear gnawing at my insides. But if I didn't take the chance, what was the alternative? Finally, I nodded. "Okay," I said, my voice steady despite the storm of doubt inside me. "We'll trust you." He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, and gave us a small nod. "Good choice," he said. "Let's go." We left the diner without looking back, following the stranger into the night. He led us through dark streets, down alleys, and into a van parked around the corner. As we climbed into the van, I couldn't help but feel the weight of our decision. This was the point of no return. There was no going back now. The van felt like a prison. It was small and cramped, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and gasoline. We sat in silence, my mother and I on one side, the stranger driving on the other. The rain had picked up again, tapping rhythmically against the windows, adding to the sense of unease that seemed to hang in the air. My mind was a whirlwind of questions, but I couldn't bring myself to ask any of them. There was a strange calmness about the man driving, the kind of calm that came with knowing exactly what was going to happen next. I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. After what seemed like hours, the van slowed to a stop. The stranger turned to us, his face serious. "We're here," he said quietly. I didn't know what to expect, but I wasn't prepared for the sight before me. The building was an old, abandoned warehouse, tucked away on the edge of town, far from any prying eyes. The rusted metal doors were barely visible in the shadows, but I could make out the faint outline of guards standing watch at the entrance. "They're here," the man muttered under his breath. I looked at him, confused. "Who?" "The people you're running from." He didn't elaborate, but I didn't need him to. The tension in the air was enough to tell me everything I needed to know. We sat there in silence, waiting, the weight of the flash drive in my pocket a constant reminder of the perilous situation we were in. My fingers kept brushing against it, and I could feel its cold presence like a ticking time bomb. The man finally broke the silence. Listen, once we go in there, things will move fast. You have to be ready for whatever comes next. The people who want that flash drive are not going to stop until they have it. I nodded, my heart racing. What do we do now? He looked at me, his gaze steady. We give it to the right people. He didn't say anything else. The words felt final, like the moment of truth was finally upon us. We got out of the van, and the cold night air hit me like a slap. My breath came out in visible clouds, and I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to calm my nerves. The building loomed ahead, its dark silhouette looking like something out of a nightmare. As we approached, the guards took notice, their eyes following us closely. The stranger led us toward the back entrance, where a door was cracked open just enough to let us slip inside unnoticed. We moved quickly, keeping to the shadows, and I felt a surge of adrenaline as we entered the warehouse. The interior was vast, empty, save for rows of crates and machinery gathering dust. Where are we? I whispered, my voice barely audible. This is a safe house, the man replied, his voice low. A place for people like you. People who know too much. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. The reality of what we were involved in was starting to sink in. We're not here for long, he continued, but long enough to get the evidence into the right hands. Once that happens, everything changes. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the dark, making me jump. You're late. The stranger froze, and I could feel his body tense. A man stepped out of the shadows, his face obscured by a mask, but his presence was undeniable. He was tall, his posture rigid, and the way he carried himself made it clear that he wasn't someone to be trifled with. Who are you? I demanded, my voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. The masked man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to the stranger. You brought them here? Are you sure this is the right decision? The stranger nodded. Yes. The masked man stared at him for a long moment before turning his gaze to me and my mother. You have the flash drive? He asked, his voice colder than ice. I hesitated, my heart racing. The decision I had made was becoming clearer with every passing second. This was it. The moment that would determine everything. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the flash drive, holding it out toward him. My hands were trembling, but I did my best to steady them. He took it without a word, his fingers brushing mine for a brief moment, and as he did, I saw something in his eyes, something I hadn't expected. It wasn't relief, it wasn't gratitude, it was something far darker. Thank you, he said quietly, and then, in a single fluid motion, he turned and walked away. My stomach sank. Something was wrong. The man who had brought us here, the stranger, looked at me, his expression unreadable. You've done your part, he said, his tone grim. Now, it's up to them. I looked back at my mother, who was standing just behind me, her face pale. She didn't know what was going on any more than I did, but I could see the fear in her eyes. Before I could ask another question, the sound of footsteps grew louder. A group of men emerged from the shadows, all wearing dark clothing, their faces hidden. The man with the flash drive handed it to one of them, and that's when I realized this wasn't a safe house at all, it was a trap. Everything in me screamed to run. My heart pounded, the blood rushing in my ears, as the men gathered around the masked man. My fingers clenched into fists at my sides, but there was nothing I could do. My entire body was frozen, paralyzed by the realization that I'd been played. The man with the flash drive handed it over with a cold, deliberate motion. The others took it from him and studied it like a precious object, their eyes never leaving the device. I felt a chill crawl over me as I realized the truth. This wasn't a group of people who were trying to save us. They were the ones we had been running from all along. The stranger, the one who had helped us, turned his back without a word. No, I whispered, barely able to get the word out. This can't be. Before I could finish, the masked man spoke, his voice echoing in the warehouse. You really thought you could outrun us? My stomach dropped. Who are you? I choked out. The man lifted his mask, revealing his face, a face I never thought I'd see again. It was Daniel. I couldn't breathe. The world tilted beneath me as I stared at him, the person I thought I had lost forever. The person I had trusted, the person who had betrayed me. You. My voice cracked as I tried to speak. You were dead? Daniel finished for me, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. No, I faked my death. I had to. They were closing in on me, and I needed to disappear. But I was never gone. I was always watching, always waiting for the right moment. I felt the ground slip from beneath me. Everything I thought I knew, everything I had believed about Daniel, about the mission, about the people we were running from, it was all a lie. "The flash drive," I whispered, feeling my hands go numb. "What's on it?" Daniel's eyes darkened. "The truth. The real truth. What your father was working on, what they didn't want anyone to know. It could bring everything down, and now, it's mine." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. The weight of everything that had been building up, the betrayals, the danger, the secrecy, came crashing down on me all at once. Daniel wasn't just part of this mess. He was the one pulling the strings. "You knew we were coming for it, didn't you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "You knew all along." Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was the answer I needed. Suddenly, everything made sense in a twisted way. The plans, the agents, the sudden appearances, all of it had been orchestrated by him. "You used me," I said, my voice barely a whisper, filled with disbelief. "You used us all." Daniel's gaze softened, almost regretful. "I didn't want to, but I had no choice. You don't understand. The people who wanted that drive, what they were going to do with it, it's far worse than anything you've imagined. I needed to protect you, protect your mother. But it was too dangerous. I couldn't let you be part of it anymore." I stumbled backward, the weight of his words pressing down on me. "So you faked your death, disappeared, and left us to deal with this alone?" "I thought it would keep you safe," Daniel said quietly. "But it didn't. I underestimated how far they'd go. How far you would go." I shook my head in disbelief, trying to process it all. "Why bring us here then? Why act like you wanted to help us?" He looked at me with a cold, distant expression. "Because you were always going to find out, eventually, and when you did, I had to make sure you didn't get in the way." The room seemed to spin around me. This was not the reunion I had expected. This was not the man I had once loved. I looked over at my mother, who had been silent this whole time. She was staring at Daniel, her expression a mixture of shock and hurt. "Mom," I whispered, feeling the lump in my throat. "We were wrong. He's not." Before I could finish, Daniel's voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. "Enough. It's over." The masked men gathered the flash drive, slipping it into a small, secure case, while Daniel stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he regarded me one last time. "I'm sorry," he said, the words coming out flat as if they were a mere formality. "But you're not part of this anymore." The door behind him opened, revealing a few more figures. Agents. They had been watching, and just like that, it was all slipping away. I took a deep breath, my mind numb with the weight of everything. I had no more fight in me. There was nothing left to do but accept it. I turned to my mother, her face pale with shock. "Let's go," I whispered. "Let's just go." Without another word, we turned and walked toward the exit. Daniel's figure remained in the shadows, watching us go. I didn't look back. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the story and the twists that kept you on the edge of your seat. If you want more thrilling, emotional stories with unexpected turns, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an update. If you liked this story, make sure to like, comment, and share it with your friends so they can experience the suspense too. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of the plot? What surprised you the most? Let's talk in the comments. Thanks again for your support. Your feedback means the world.